My boyfriend let his racist family mock me after I served Chinese food, and now he is facing the fallout. And I want to tell you about the dinner and the drive home and the phone call the next day, because the three things together were what produced the fallout. And the fallout was not what he was expecting, because he had been preparing for the fallout to be about his family, and the fallout was actually about him. I am Chinese American. My boyfriend is Daniel. He is white. We had been dating for 10 months. His mother had asked me what to bring. She had said, make us something you make at home. I made a homemade dumpling dish my grandmother had taught me. The dumplings were a thing I had been making since I was 12. The dumplings were a thing my grandmother had given me before she died, and that I made because making them was a way of being close to her. We arrived. Everyone greeted me warmly. The greeting was carefully warm in a way I had registered without commenting on. I put the dumplings on the counter. His mother said how interesting. She said it the way I had been hearing white people say how interesting my entire life when they were trying to manage their reaction to a thing they had not made themselves. The dinner began. His brother's fiancée picked up a dumpling. She held it on her fork. She said how exotic. She said it the way people say exotic when they are being a specific kind of polite. His sister said, are these like the kind you get from the takeout place? The whole family started telling stories about the Chinese takeout place from 20 years ago. The stories were warm. The stories were nostalgic. The stories were about the family's relationship with Chinese food, which was a relationship mediated through a takeout place from 20 years ago. His brother said, you know what? I have always wondered. He said, do you know what dog tastes like? The whole family laughed harder. His mother said, your brother. She said it indulgently. She said it the way mothers say things about sons they are going to allow. I looked at Daniel. Daniel was sitting next to me. Daniel was holding his fork. Daniel was looking at his plate. Daniel was waiting for it to pass. Daniel had decided in the moment that the strategy was waiting. I set down my fork. I said, I am going to use the bathroom. I texted my best friend Yuna. I said his brother just made a joke about Chinese people eating dogs. I said the whole family laughed. I said Daniel did not say anything. Yuna said leave. I came out. I picked up my coat. I picked up the carrier with the remaining dumplings. I said I am going to head home. Daniel stood up. Daniel said I will drive you. I said no. I said I drove myself here. I will drive myself home. I said goodnight. I said it the way a person says goodnight when they are not going to come back. I drove home. I cried in the car. I was not thinking about his family. His family had told me who they were and I had received the information. I was thinking about Daniel. I was thinking about Daniel sitting next to me. I had been seeing small versions of the waiting throughout the 10 months. The dinner version had not been small. Daniel called. The voicemail said I am sorry about my family. I noticed that the voicemail was about his family. I noticed that the voicemail was not about him. The next morning, he called again. I answered. I said, why are you apologizing for your family? He said, because they were horrible. I said, why are you not apologizing for yourself? He said, what do you mean? I said, you decided who you were going to be in that room. You decided to wait. I am asking you why you are not apologizing for the deciding. He said I had not thought about it that way. I said I am asking you to apologize for what you did and not for what they did. I will call you in a week. I called my grandmother, who was still alive at 91. My grandmother said the dumplings are not for them. The dumplings are for you. You bring those dumplings to people who deserve them. Nede. My grandmother said, are you going to stay with this man? I said I do not know. My grandmother said the man who waits for racism to pass while you are next to him is the man who will wait for it to pass when you have children with him. Your children will see him wait. Your children will see what waiting means. You are deciding now what your children will see. I gave Daniel the week. He called me at the end of the week. He said I do not know what to apologize for. My brother said the thing. My brother is the one who needs to apologize. I said the waiting was the thing. He said, but I did not say anything bad. I said I have explained the thing twice and you do not understand it. The not understanding is information. I said good luck. I said goodbye. I thought it was going to be the end of it and it was not. The dinner and Daniel's silence and my departure and the breakup, all of those things were the first part. The second part was what Daniel did after. 2 weeks passed. The rawness was not about regret. The rawness was about grief. I was grieving the version of Daniel I had thought existed. The version who would have heard his brother say that and turned to him and said no. That version had lived in my head for 10 months, and that version had died at the dinner table, and I was mourning him the way you mourn someone who was never real. Some nights I made dumplings alone the way my grandmother Lena had shown me. The making felt different now. The dinner had clarified who the dumplings were for and who they were not for. Then Daniel started texting again. The texts were long. One of them said, I have been reading about this. He sent me a link to an article about allyship. The texts had the sound of someone performing understanding. They did not have the sound of someone who understood. The difference is the same difference between someone who cries at a movie about racism and someone who says something when racism happens in the room they are standing in. Daniel was crying at the movie. Yuna came over. Yuna said, you know he's going to try harder, right? I said, I know. Yuna said, what are you going to do when he does? I said, I am going to do nothing. Yuna said, doing nothing is harder than it sounds when you still care about someone. She was right. Doing nothing in the face of texts and articles and I understand now is work, the hardest kind. The work is staying still when everything inside you wants to move toward the thing that is familiar and warm even when you know the familiar warm thing is not safe. Then Daniel showed up at my apartment. He did not call first. He was holding flowers. The flowers were the kind I liked. He had been paying attention to the easy things. He was good at the easy things. He said, can we talk? Just 10 minutes. I let him in. I knew it was the mistake while I was doing it. Part of me wanted him to have figured it out. Part of me wanted to be wrong about the waiting. Part of me wanted the version of Daniel I had been mourning to walk through my door holding flowers and prove that he had been real all along. Daniel sat at my table. He said, I should have said something. I should have stood up for you. I said, why didn't you? He said, because I was afraid of making a scene. I said, your brother made a joke about my culture eating dogs. While I was feeding your family food my grandmother taught me to make, and your concern was making a scene. He did not answer. The silence at the dinner table and the silence in my apartment were the same silence. The silence of a man who had been taught that the worst thing you can do in a room is make people uncomfortable, even when the comfort of the room is built on top of someone else's pain. Then he changed his voice. He said, I was scared. I was scared of my own family. I have always been scared of my own family. I have never been the one who pushes back. I felt something move inside me. It was the first honest thing he had said since the dinner. I could feel myself soften. I could feel feel the door that I had closed wanting to open. I said, I believe you were scared. I did. I believed the waiting was not cruelty. I believed the waiting was fear. But fear was not an excuse. Fear was a reason, but it was not a reason that was good enough. I said, but Daniel, if we had kids, if your brother said that joke in front of our children, would you be scared then too? He said, that's different, because they would be my kids. I felt the softening stop. I felt it stop the way water stops when it hits something frozen. He had just told me that a child who did not exist would be enough to make him brave. But I, a real person, sitting in a real chair at a real dinner table being really humiliated, I had not been enough. I said, and I was your girlfriend, sitting right next to you, and I wasn't enough for you to be brave. He said, that's not what I meant. I said, it is exactly what you meant. A child who does not exist would be enough to make you act. A real person being really humiliated was not. He said, you are twisting my words. I said, I am repeating them. He stood up. He left. He did not take the flowers. I was shaking, not because I was scared, because I had almost let the softening win. For a moment, his fear had been enough. I called my mother Kira. I told her. My mother said, the almost is the hardest part. The almost is what makes you stay. The almost was the trap. The almost was the thing that made you think maybe if I just give him one more chance. My father Watson got on the phone. He said, if he showed up at your apartment without calling first, he is not thinking about what you need. He is thinking about what he needs. He was right. Every move Daniel had made since the breakup had been about Daniel. None of it had been about me. 3 days later, I got a call from Lavinia, Daniel's mother. Lavinia said, sweetheart, Daniel is a wreck. Can you just talk to him? I said, did Daniel tell you why we broke up? Lavinia said, he said you had a disagreement about the dinner. I said, did he tell you what your son Bruce said to me at the dinner? Lavinia said, boys will be boys. Bruce has always had a big mouth. He didn't mean anything by it. I said, he asked me if I knew what dog tasted like, and everyone laughed, including you. Lavinia said, I think you might be remembering it differently than it happened. I said, I am not. Goodbye, Lavinia. I hung up. The phone call was the dinner. The same family doing the same thing, which was deciding that the comfort of their version of events was more important than the truth of mine. But something was bothering me. I was afraid that my standard was too high. I was afraid that what I was asking for, a man who stands up without being asked, did not exist. I called my grandmother Lena. I said, Grandma, did Grandpa ever have to stand up for you? My grandmother said, once, early, before we were married, a man at a market said something about me. Your grandfather turned around. Your grandfather said, you will not speak to her that way. The man laughed. Your grandfather said it again, louder. The man stopped laughing. My grandmother said, I married him 3 months later. I did not marry him because he was brave. I married him because being brave for me was not something he had to think about. It was not a decision. It was who he was. I cried. My grandmother said, your standard is not too high. Your standard is the minimum. The minimum is someone for whom protecting you is not a decision. The distance between my grandfather turning around and Daniel looking at his plate was everything. I started making dumplings on Wednesday nights. The Wednesday dumplings became a ritual. They became mine. Then Daniel texted one final time. I talked to my brother. I told him the joke was wrong. He said he was sorry. I told my family that what happened at dinner was not okay. I did the thing you asked me to do. Can we please talk? I read it 3 times. He said I did the thing you asked me to do. He had framed standing up against racism as a thing I asked him to do. Not a thing he needed to do. Not a thing he believed in. A task. An assignment. A box to check. He had talked to his brother the way a kid does homework. He had done the thing and now he was turning it in and waiting for his grade. I called him. He picked up on the first ring. He said, I talked to them. I did it. He sounded proud. He sounded like he was presenting a completed assignment. I said, why did you talk to your brother? He said, because you wanted me to. I said, and if I had never wanted you to? If I had laughed along at the dinner and said nothing? Would you have gone home that night and thought that joke my brother made was racist and I need to say something? He was quiet for a long time. He said, I don't know. I said, that is the answer. You needed me, a Chinese woman, to be hurt in front of you, and then to explain to you why I was hurt, and then to leave you, and then to ask you to think about it before you considered saying something to your brother about a racist joke. That is not standing up for me, Daniel. That is following instructions. He said, what do you want from me? I said, I wanted you to be the kind of person who didn't need me to want it. I wanted you to be the person who heard your brother say that and felt something inside you that said no. Not because of me, because of you, because it was wrong. He said, so nothing I do is enough. I said, everything you do is enough if you do it because you believe it. Nothing you do is enough if you do it because I asked. He said, I don't know how to be the person you want me to be. I said, I know. That's why we're done. I hung up. I did not cry this time. The following Sunday, I went to my grandmother Lena's house. My parents were there. My grandmother said, come, we are making dumplings. Her hands over mine, the same way they had always been. My mother Kira was cutting chives. My father Watson was setting the table. Nobody asked about Daniel. Nobody needed to. My grandmother looked at me across the table and nodded once. The nod said everything. I drove home that night. I made a note in my phone of my grandmother's recipe. Every measurement, every fold, every instruction. I wrote at the bottom, for people who deserve them. I went to bed. I slept well.